Yeah. Can people hear me? See me? Are the slides up?
Yeah, we can see your slides.
Yay! Okay. Well, thank you all. I particularly want to thank the organizers for putting this on, and I am truly honored to be here. This is something I've been looking forward to for quite some time. So I'm going to talk today about designing progressive web apps, sort of following on a little bit about actually what the previous speaker was talking about and what Colin talked about earlier when it comes to progressive web apps, but looking at it specifically from the sorts of questions that a web team might face as they start doing this. We've had a couple of our clients where the president or the CEO of the organization comes to the web team and basically declares that they need a progressive web app. And oftentimes the team itself isn't as familiar with a progressive web app, or at least not all of the members on the team. The developers might be familiar, but oftentimes the designers, the product owners, the business owners aren't as familiar. So I want to talk about the sorts of questions that that team will face as they start to build a progressive web app. And probably the most pressing one is simply like, how does the CEO even know about progressive web apps? And the CEO does know about that sort of stuff because the press that they read have been talking quite a bit about progressive web apps. Everything from Total Retail and Digiday from an advertising perspective to CMO, like marketing magazines, like the press that executives read are talking about these things. And they're talking about them because of the fact that organizations like Conga are talking about how much less data is downloaded for each transaction. Companies are sharing their success. Pinterest has written about how they've seen increases in user-generated ad revenue, ad click-through rates, user engagement. They have written about, just recently, a couple weeks ago, they did a follow-up post talking about how they've had their progressive web app for a year now. And it used to be that mobile web was the least likely way that somebody would find or sign up for Pinterest. And now it is the most likely way. We hear so many of these stories that we created a website called pwastats.com that allows people to keep track of, or where we keep track of case studies where people publish about progressive web apps. The other question that organizations bump into, and probably there are people in the room who have done progressive web apps, maybe some folks who haven't done this. I don't want to go into great detail on this, but we do run into situations where people don't know what a progressive web app is. And even people who have built progressive web apps have written about how confusing it is. And the reason it's confusing is because when Francis Berryman and Alex Russell came up with the definition for a progressive web app, they observed some behavior they were seeing out in the world related to websites that were doing things that previously hadn't been done. And they created this definition list, these 10 things. Progressive web apps are responsive, they're connectivity independent, so they're resilient to networks. They have app-like interactions, they're safe, they're fresh, they're discoverable, meaning they can be installed, they declare themselves as an app, they're re-engageable, they're linkable, and progressive. And those last two, I think, are the really important pieces because there have been a lot of attempts to do this sort of stuff with the web before, like Adobe Air, that weren't really part of the web. But despite this sort of clear definition, Google on their site, when they first started talking about progressive web apps, wrote about how there were 6 definitions, or they had this first 10, and then they narrowed it to 6 things that didn't quite match. And right now, if you go to their site, they talk about fast, reliable, and engaging. They recently added integrated so that they could have this definition that's FIRE. It's fast, integrated, reliable, and engaging. But that really doesn't tell us much of anything. Like Craigslist might qualify as fast, integrated, reliable, and engaging. So thankfully, Jeremy, who I believe is speaking tomorrow to you all. He had written about how a progressive web app is simply a website that's enhanced with HTTPS, a service worker, and a manifest file. And this is actually the definition that I had intuitively been using when I tried to make decisions about whether to include something in PWA stats or not. So I find this definition to be really helpful. The key here is the service worker, which I know Colin talked at length about earlier, and how it creates things that are more performant. And I tend to think of progressive web apps as a Trojan horse for performance. The performance related aspects of it, I think, are where the big wins come in for users. But progressive web apps allow us to build experiences that previously required native applications. And the sort of ambiguous sort of buzz hype around progressive web apps allow organizations to revisit the web in a way that they may not have revisited in a while, and to think about what's possible there, and to realize that over the last decade that browser makers have spent a lot of time making browsers better, making them more feature rich, and so it's possible to do things that we weren't able to do before. I keep reading articles talking about how you can't use the camera on the web, or you know, like which Instagram has a progressive web app, so that's not true. Or you can't use your fingerprint sensor. And I'm writing a book on progressive web apps, and I was trying to take a screenshot of the payment request API on my phone and accidentally bought a pair of socks. Because to take a screenshot, you actually use the same buttons for taking a screenshot as you do like actually purchasing something on an iOS device. So I think that the web can do much more than we commonly think it can. So the team may get together and say, okay, let's do this. Let's go build a progressive web app. And when we start thinking about design, not from a like how do things look perspective, but a what is the strategy, what are the capital D design decisions that we're going to make, I think that we can really look at progressive web apps in 5 different sort of factors. Making it feel like an app. How do we make sure that people can install it and discover it? What do we do with offline mode? What do we do with push notifications? And then what do we do with the things that aren't technically part of a progressive web app, like the payment request API, accelerated mobile pages, AMP pages, or credential management API, those sorts of things that aren't technically part of progressive web apps, but are things that people commonly think about when they're looking at doing a progressive web app. I'm not gonna have time to go into number 5. I'm just going to look at sort of the first 4. So when it comes to making something feel like an app, this is probably the most difficult one to sort out, because people don't have common definitions of what it means for something to be a web app versus a website. Chris Coyer on CSS Tricks a couple of years ago did this quiz or this survey where he asked people, you know, is it important to distinguish? And 72% said that yes, they're different things with different concerns. But if you read the comments on that post, nobody agrees. Nobody agrees what makes something a web app versus a website. Jeremy Keith said that like obscenity and brunch, web apps can be described but not defined. And so as you and your colleagues start talking about building a progressive web app, I can guarantee you the fact that it's an app is going to seem like it's something important. The fact that, but what that means is probably going to be different for each person in the room. Often what we think of when we talk about making something feel like an app is making it look native. And this goal can be challenging. We can accomplish some of this. We can, for example, change the fonts to replicate the system fonts for a particular operating system. But how many platforms will you adapt to, right? Like we don't currently adapt our websites on desktop to look like Mac or Windows. And then when the platform changes that design language, like Microsoft did a couple of years ago when they moved to Fluent design, do you change your app accordingly? Or when iOS changes from sort of the skeuomorphic design to the flat design of iOS 7? Do you change? Does your whole entire web application need to change then? I think that we're better off defining our own design and being consistent. This is TripCase. It's a travel application. It's a phone gap application that feels great whether you're on Android or on iOS. In interest of full disclosure, we did a bit of work on this app, but we didn't design it. What I really appreciate about the app is that they just created what they thought would be the best mobile experience, and they made sure that it didn't stand out on any particular platform, and it works really, really well. Another way in which people want to have something that feels like an app is to have a more immersive experience. And with the manifest file in a progressive web app, we can declare different display modes. Everything from browser, which still has all of the Chrome, to minimal UI, a little bit smaller Chrome, standalone, where we lose the address bar, and then full screen. And with full screen, we've got that full immersive experience. But I think in a lot of ways, we're spoiled by our browsers. We don't realize all of the things that browsers provide for us. Everything from the status bar and the address bar where the URLs are that we use for sharing, to navigation like back buttons. And then inside menus even, things like find in page, downloading, and then the ability to print and to email. And so when you move to full screen, you have to add these things back. Even something like adding the back button is harder than it seems. First off, if you've got a traditional web application where you haven't had to manage the back button history or the browser history, all of a sudden that becomes something you have to concern yourself with. And a back button in an app often implies a hierarchy. For example, in that little short video there, somebody goes from the Polymer Shop homepage to a product category page to a product, and then up to the category page, and then down to the product. And you have this sort of pogo sticking back and forth behavior. But the web's not that way. The web isn't linear in that fashion. As a matter of fact, you could go to a search result and go directly to a product page. And then, and this is exactly what you would see. You would have a back button in the page and a back button in the browser Chrome, but they don't go to the same location. Even though they look very similar, the back button for the browser goes back to the search results, whereas the back button in the page would go up to the product category page and sort of go into that app hierarchy. We have a way to make decisions about this. There's a new display mode media query that allows us to know what mode we are in, and maybe we only display the back button if we're in full screen, or maybe full screen and standalone. We have to sort of adapt to this new idea that like when we adapted to responsive design, where we were designing for a continuum of screen sizes, we have to design for a continuum of contexts, because not every person is going to actually install the progressive web app to their home screen. The majority of people will probably interact with it inside of browser Chrome. But because service workers and push notifications on all those things work, even if somebody doesn't have it on their home screen, everybody's going to visit, or everybody kind of will install your progressive web app, even if they never have the icon. I think we get a little too fixated on the icon part. Another way that people want to make something feel like an app is to have fast and fluid experiences. So we can do that, and native apps do this all the time, but from a web perspective, we can do it with service workers, because we can use skeleton pages to have placeholders for images and other assets, so that before a page loads, we've already set aside all the space so the page doesn't jump as somebody scrolls. There are a few things more irritating than, as you're reading an article, having the thing that you're reading move as you're trying to read. Another thing that Google spends a lot of time talking about is this app shell model of progressive web apps, where the app shell is the header, the footer, the menu, the things that are sort of containing the content. And with a service worker, we could store all that stuff in the cache explicitly and then only go get the new content. In many ways, this is what native apps do, right? They download a binary that contains all of that shell, and then they just go get new content. And doing this means that you've got a much faster experience because perceived performance matters more than actual performance. And so the fact that that stuff is available offline means that the shell can be put on the screen really quickly. But for a lot of organizations, app shell also means a big investment in re-architecting their site. It probably means moving from a traditional web architecture with a series of page requests to something that is a single page application, or using some of the newer technologies like streams to possibly replicate something like a single page application. So I think it's important to note that progressive web apps do not necessarily mean that you're doing a single page application. Our website is a progressive web app. It's really fast. We designed the site to be fast. It was fast before we made it into a progressive web app. Once we had done so, it was so fast that it didn't seem like there was going to be a big benefit to making it into a single page application. And it was built on WordPress because we really like being able to have content and articles that people can comment on and interact with. And so we just decided that this wasn't a necessary part of what we needed to do. The last bit is that feeling like an app shouldn't be a goal unto itself. People who, whether your progressive web app is more of an app or site, isn't something that users are going to be thinking about as they interact with it. They're just going to want an exceptional experience. And so now when we think about feeling like an app, we have this sort of continuum from basically having something that is a website that's using progressive web app technology for performance and improvements to something that's full screen, app shell, using native design language. And we've got really less complex versions and more complex versions of something when it comes to a progressive web app. All right, the second factor is installation and discovery. So manifest files are simple JSON documents where we declare stuff about a progressive web app, like the name and icons and things of that nature. And we can do a little bit with this to actually provide a better experience. So we can declare what the startup screen's background color should be. But as you'll note here, since they look different, you should really test that because each browser handles it differently. We can also set theme colors. So even if somebody never actually installs a progressive web app, they can have an experience that feels more custom. Lyft does a really good job of this, where their theme color actually makes the whole thing feel like an app even before you install it, because the browser Chrome just sort of blends in with their overall design. Once you've got a manifest and you've got a progressive web app, browsers will start prompting people to install your progressive web app. So in Firefox and in Samsung, they have add to home screen badges. So in Firefox, it goes from, they add a little icon with a home and a plus button. On Samsung, it switches from being a star to a plus, and then once you select it, it opens up and has the add to home screen option. These are very subtle. So Firefox actually provides people with something that says, hey, look at this, this is a new icon, this is how it works. Chrome and Opera are doing something a little more invasive. So they have banners that pop up on the screen and say add to home screen. They catch more of the user's attention. But because they're more invasive, they have heuristics where users have to interact with the site, interact with the progressive web app for a certain amount of time before they will actually get those prompts. Flipkart, an e-commerce company in India, has done something I think is sort of a best practice in this regard. They wait till the browser says, hey, this user's passed in user engagement threshold. And they basically say, thank you for that. And they just hold on to it. And then they wait until the order confirmation page when, and they think that somebody will be more likely to install it. And then they prompt for the add to home screen. And by doing so, they see a 3x increase in conversion. And this is a best practice now, but it's pretty much going to be the only way we can do this stuff in the future if we want to have this sort of larger add to home screen. Chrome has already announced that they are moving to a mini info bar, and then eventually moving to the sorts of badging that we saw in Firefox and Samsung. And so if you want to have a larger prompt, you have to wait until the user has passed that engagement level, and then you have to, as a developer, declare the prompt yourself. So again, we have this continuum between a less complex version where maybe you don't care if people add it to your home screen, to like really complex things where you might use PhoneGap and trusted web activities to actually put progressive web apps inside native app stores. We also, for offline mode, we can do simple things like caching for performance and having an offline fallback. Even our offline fallback pages can be more interesting. So Trivago has a maze on their offline fallback page that they found that people will return to more once they hit that page. If we're going to do stuff offline, we should let users choose what they want offline. So it becomes really important to communicate what's happening. You can see that as Financial Times actually pre-caches a lot of information, that they let people know what's going on, and they give people control. They give people the option of being able to go in and turn things off. Again, we've got this complex continuum where we have the ability to just cache things for performance, to actually having things like probably a really difficult computer science problem of allowing people to edit things in a distributed manner while offline, and then sort of reconciling that when they come back online. From a push notification perspective, there are a bunch of hidden challenges. From a front end perspective, it's actually pretty easy to add a subscribe button and connect somebody to a push notification service. But Slack, for example, when they make a decision whether to send a notification or not, they have this complex flowchart because they need to send notifications that are personalized and based on what device somebody's using. We have to be really careful because people are really annoyed with push notifications. So we don't want to ask immediately for permission to send push notifications. Twitter Lite does this really well. They only send push notifications when somebody clicks on the notification tab. Only then do they show the browser prompt. And then they give people a confirmation that then they can use to go and customize their notifications. And this is really important because browsers have implemented kill switches where if somebody doesn't like notifications, they can turn it off and you'll never get to ask them again. Chrome has also made a change where now users can no longer ignore permissions prompts. It used to be that they could either tap elsewhere on the screen or tap the X and just ignore it, and 90% of users did that. But now Chrome is saying you have to make a decision, and they did it so that developers have incentives to be able to continue to go on to the modals, or to make sure that they ask when it's context. So push notifications are also on this sort of continuum. And the last bit I want to talk about is how do we create a plan for something like this? And the way to do so is to roll out incrementally these improvements. That's one of the great things about progressive web apps. And this is what we did with our site, and you can do something similar. The only things you probably need to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you have that you sort of think about where you want to be on those continuums. Benchmark things ahead of time to make sure that you can measure stuff. You also will want to assess your current site to make sure that it is fast enough. If your site currently loads on 30 seconds on 3G, it's probably not going to do, like adding a service worker won't cut it. We also have had customers that have websites that aren't usable on mobile devices. But you can build a roadmap where you go from doing some planning and definition to doing technical, sort of like assessing that technical debt, and then build a baseline, do some front end additions, do things that don't require changing the back end infrastructure, and then maybe larger, more complex initiatives. And the great thing is that you can roll out those incremental improvements all along the way and provide value for the people who visit your site. And this is, I think, the really powerful thing about progressive web apps is that each step on the path to a progressive web app makes sense on its own. You just have to start working on them. That's it. Thank you.